When my college agent Chris first asked me to prepare this educational talk, I tried to think back to when I was in college, which I promise was not that long ago. I am only 34. And I was thinking about what I would have liked to see on campus. So when I first began my college career, as I mentioned, majoring in theater arts and minoring in creative writing, I didn't realize that 10 years later I would be working as a professional comedian. To be honest, at that point, I was not aware of very many professional comedians, and I was even less aware of any professional female comedians or any queer, trans, or non-binary professional comedians. The thought had not crossed my mind as a viable career option. At the time when I first entered college, when I was 18, I still thought that somehow I would be some sort of Broadway star, even though I continuously failed my college's dance audition 3 times, and I just kept coming back, and they were like, please stop. ER Fightmaster, who you'll see on the screen there, who is a great non-binary actor who is also very hot, recently said on a podcast that if we cannot see ourselves, we cannot be ourselves. Now, they were talking about the concept of representation in the media, which has recently become a huge talking point. In fact, you guys, this is such a big talking point that it might feel a bit oversaturated at this point in 2024. However, representation was not really being discussed until the 2010s. Many of us in minority groups knew how special it felt to see ourselves represented in television, film, books, music, comedy, anything that was part of the zeitgeist. The push for representation and the saying representation matters, though, have only recently begun. So what is representation and why is it important? I assume that everyone here at the Rochester Rainbow Union already knows the answer to that question, but just so we can get our talk started, I'll go a little bit more in depth about it. The saying representation matters may not be as clear-cut to some as it is to others, particularly for people who have always seen themselves represented in a positive light through media, right? So if you Google the meaning of the phrase representation matters, one of the first things to come up is a lecture from the University of Toronto in which they say that the idea of representation is the basic idea that if students in academia see people like themselves reflected in course materials, they are more likely to identify with and be able to imagine themselves belonging in that field. So if we're talking about academia, a really good example of this is the push for women in STEM. This is something that has only really come about within the past 10 years, but it is basically the idea behind it is that because math and science fields are typically very male-dominated, young girls do not pursue these studies as often because they do not see themselves as scientists and engineers. Now, the idea behind pushing for women in STEM is that if more women began working in STEM, girls will see this as a viable career path and that will show more interest in these fields of study. A good way to get children interested is to start them while they are still very young and they can envision a broad future for themselves. So that is why many STEM camps aimed particularly at young girls were founded in the early 2010s. Of course, as I mentioned, I am a comedian and a writer, and I do not know anything about STEM, but I do know a lot about entertainment. And sometimes, more often than you think, entertainment can influence our career paths as well. And before there were science camps aiming to get little girls interested in becoming physicists and astronauts, there was one show that really changed the course of history. And that show is Star Trek by Gene Roddenberry. It was first released on September 8th, 1966, and it was one of the most influential television shows of the 20th century. Now, does people in the room, have you guys seen the original Star Trek? Okay, you've seen it. All right, you've seen it. Have you guys are like younger. Have you seen a little bit? Okay, all right, that's fair. That's fair enough. I only saw it because my dad forced me to watch it a lot. My dad was obsessed with the show Star Trek, and we have seen every iteration of Star Trek. There's been countless ones that have been done. There's been movies, there's been TV shows. But the one that he really liked was the OG series. And he used to, we would watch it on Tuesday nights. I remember when I was a kid, and this was back in the 90s. I'm very youthful, don't worry. But I remember that he used to push the TV. This is back when we had TV that you could roll out. He would push the TV into the kitchen, and we would have Taco Tuesday and watch Star Trek. So when I first was writing this talk, I was like, I simply must discuss Star Trek because my dad was preparing me for this moment since I was nary but a child. So as I said, it was one of the most influential shows of the 20th century. I have seen every single version of it, and I can tell you what it did for representation. Now, although the star of the show is undoubtedly the captain of the Enterprise, who is also truly just a brazen womanizer, his name is James T. Kirk, my favorite character was always Lieutenant Uhura. She was the communications officer. There she is, Lieutenant Nyota Uhura. She was played by Nichelle Nichols, and she was the first black woman to be portrayed in a non-menial role on an American network television series. So when we say non-menial role, we mean she wasn't working in the kitchen, she wasn't cleaning up after people, she actually had a career. And Whoopi Goldberg, who would go on to be featured in Star Trek: The Next Generation, one of the many various Star Trek spin-off shows, she described seeing Uhura as a role model, saying that when she was a little girl, she saw her on the TV and she ran into the other room to tell her family, "I just saw a black woman on television and she's not a maid." Uhura's impact was so strong, in fact, that later on, when the actress Nichelle Nichols was thinking of leaving the show, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. implored her to reconsider, which I think is wild. Can you imagine? She was actually at a conference. This is back when they first started doing Star Trek conferences for Trekkies, so people who love Star Trek. She was at this conference, word had spread she was gonna leave the show, right? And she was like in the dressing room, and they came back and they said, "Nichelle, you have a special guest who wants to meet you." And she figured, oh, it's some guy who loves Star Trek. And then it was Martin Luther King Jr., and he was like, "Please don't leave the show," which I think that is mind-boggling, really, that the civil rights leader came in and told her not to leave the show. So of course she did not leave the show. He told her that for the first time, we are being seen the world over as we should be seen. And how could she argue with that? She decided to stay on the show. And the cultural impact of her character went far beyond the world of television. NASA actually employed Nichelle Nichols in a campaign to try to encourage women and people of color to join NASA. And Dr. Mae Jemison, who we have a picture of here, Dr. Mae Jemison, who was the very first black woman to ever be the very first, I want to get it right, when she was the first black woman to fly aboard the space shuttle. That's what I wanted to say. She was the very first black woman to fly aboard the space shuttle, and she actually cited Lieutenant Nyota Uhura as an inspiration and said that she grew up watching Star Trek, and that influenced her to join NASA. Malcolm X famously said that the most disrespected woman in America is a black woman, and in many, many ways that is still very true. But it was through this sci-fi lens that we were able to see a reality in which black women are respected and admired and treated equally to their white counterparts. We still have not achieved this reality in America, but maybe one day it will be possible. In fact, Uhura and Captain Kirk also shared a kiss on the episode's Plato's Stepchild in 1968. And this was one of the first examples of an interracial kiss ever shown on United States television networks, and it actually caused a huge uproar, so much so that in the South they stopped playing Star Trek entirely. It was pulled from the network. I think this really means a lot to me, I guess, as someone who's in an interracial lesbian marriage, but also I think it could mean a lot to all of us because it is a really stark reminder that interracial marriage was not always legal and has not been legal for very long. And it's still very negatively viewed in some parts of the country. And gay interracial marriage, or gay marriage of any sort, would not have been nationally recognized by the United States government until 2015. So although the concept of representation was not being talked about really in 1966, when Star Trek, the original series, first aired, Lieutenant Uhura is a perfect example of why representation matters. Through this example, you can clearly see how media and entertainment affect the viewers' real lives. Yes, of course, it is true that Star Trek is set in an almost utopian future where capitalism has been abolished and everyone lives in an egalitarian society. But when black women and young black girls saw themselves on television, being treated with respect, being able to explore new realms, and being in a job that wasn't a maid, they could imagine themselves in Uhura's shoes. It is no coincidence that NASA actually recruited a lot of black astronauts after the release of Star Trek. As I mentioned, Mae Jemison, the first black woman to be aboard the space shuttle. As E.R. Fightmaster said, if we cannot see ourselves, we cannot be ourselves. So for this part, you don't worry, I won't make you talk or anything, but usually what I do when I talk at college is I like to have everyone in the room just quickly think back to the first time that you can remember seeing someone like yourself on screen, or when maybe you read about a character that reminded you of yourself in a book. Think back to the very earliest memory that you can have of that. And then we'll just have that in our minds. All right, now for me, because I grew up as a white child in America, I always saw myself represented in media in some way. My namesake, Madelein, let's see her, there she is. She's the rapscallion little French girl. I'm sure you guys know her from the Ludwig Bellman's children's books. She was one of the first examples in literature that I saw, in children's literature, of someone who not only looked like me, but also had the same personality as me. She was attention-seeking, loud, boisterous, always giving her caretaker, Miss Clavel, a run for her money. She was very wild, and I really wanted to be just like her. I thought she was so cool. I also found myself connecting strongly with male characters like Aladdin and Huckleberry Finn. And when I was thinking about this, when I was writing this talk, I was like, what is the common thread between Madeleine and Aladdin and Huckleberry Finn? And I think maybe what it is that they were all like little rapscallions who always had the attention of girls. Like that was their whole thing, was just like getting the attention of girls. And when I was little, I thought that was the coolest thing that you could possibly do. So, although I was privileged, very privileged as a white child in seeing many examples of myself in media, I did not often see queer women or lesbians represented in a positive light or represented at all. In her graphic novel that was later adapted into a Broadway musical, Fun Home, Alison Bechdel describes being a little girl and seeing a butch lesbian for the first time. In the musical adaptation of Fun Home, this moment is captured through a song entitled Ring of Keys, which I'm sure you guys can imagine if you've ever seen a butch lesbian with a carabiner. That is what the entire song is about. It's kind of goofy. It was definitely made into a lot of memes, but beneath that very funny exterior, the song is relatable, especially when young Allison's internal monologue to the butch-presenting stranger is, I know you, I know you. Every queer adult has probably had a similar experience as a child. When you see someone who doesn't quite fall under the umbrella of heteronormativity, without understanding why, you want to maybe be close to them or study them or be friends with them. You want to be like them. I remember when I was a child, I was about age 5, and I was at Canandaigua Lake with my family, and I saw my cousin who had a girlfriend, and my mom pulled me aside, because my mom was one of those moms who was always like, I have to explain this to my daughter. So she pulled me aside, and she said that my cousin and her girlfriend were a couple in the same way that my aunt and uncle were a couple, or that my mom and dad were a couple. And although my mom was in the right to tell me this, I think she was in the right, especially in 1995, when being out and proud in upstate New York was not quite as common as it is now. I already knew that they were a couple. It was never a question for me, because I saw them, and I felt that pull of familiarity. So I was very lucky to grow up with a mom who works as a children's librarian, and because of her expertise and guidance, I was shown stories about many kinds of people from a very young age. It was my mom who introduced me to the concept of windows and mirrors. So this is like inside baseball about library stuff that I will tell you guys now. So mirrors is the idea of representation, what we've been talking about. This is about children's literature. It's the idea that children need to see themselves and people like them represented through media. Now windows, I'm sure you can imagine, means that children also benefit from seeing people who are different from them represented in media. So it's really important for children to see people who are different from them socioeconomically, racially, people who have different gender expressions, sexualities, things that are outside of what is considered the norm. If children see things like this, if they see people like this from a very early age, they are more likely to be kind and empathetic and to relate to or sympathize with people who aren't just like them. A great example of a book that served as a window for me as a child was this book, Amazing Grace. Here it is. This is Amazing Grace. It's written by Mary Hoffman. This was one of my favorite books when I was little. This children's book was really one of my all-time favorites. My mom read it to me all the time. It has great illustrations. I really like it. It follows the story of Grace. She's a young black girl who loves to act out stories. So she's really into performing. She always wants to give herself the lead role. And I felt that this was very relatable when I was a child. So Grace auditions for the role of Peter Pan in her school play. And classmates tell her that she can't play the role because she is a girl and because she is black. This is one of the first times in Grace's young life where she has felt discouraged or unsure of herself, and is one of her first encounters with casual racism. Grace's mother and grandmother, they're very upset by this, of course, and they don't want Grace to be discouraged. So her grandmother takes her to see the ballet, where Rosalie Wilkins, who is a black ballerina, is in a starring role in Romeo and Juliet. Now, after Grace sees Rosalie, she is once again inspired that she can play any role, and she ultimately lands the role of Peter Pan. So as I said, I really loved this book growing up. I think it's great. And I think even now in 2024, I think it's still a pretty good example of representation on many levels, even though it is a book from the 90s. I think it is still pretty good. For starters, as I said, it served for me as a window, because I was someone who was growing up white in a predominantly white town. So I was seeing the story of a little girl who was black, who was living in a predominantly black neighborhood in the city, and what her life was like. But it also has a very real example of representation right in the book. So it is through seeing the ballerina Rosalie Wilkins that Grace once again feels powerful and confident. This book also does a great job of pointing out that children often believe they can be anything until someone tells them that they can't. In the beginning of the book, Grace is casting herself in every lead role, right? She sees no reason why she wouldn't be Peter Pan in the school play. It isn't until her encounters with casual sexism and racism that the seed of doubt is planted in her mind. I believe that even though this is a fictional book, that this is a perfect reflection of what actually happens to children in real life. And I think this book is a good way to discuss issues of gender and race discrimination with young children without having to get into anything too horrible. As certain children's books continue to be banned in more conservative states, and some government officials believe that we shouldn't teach critical race theory in schools, we desperately need representation in children's media. Many who are against the teaching of critical race theory say things like it is unfair to the white children because it will make them feel bad or guilty. Now that I am an adult, I have fully fleshed out ideas about this. And one of those ideas is that we cannot teach American history, or world history for that matter, without white people sometimes experiencing some guilt, right, or unpleasant feelings. This is okay, though. We're okay. It's okay. People who benefit from systemic racism need to be aware of how they are benefiting. It's okay for us to feel discomfort. It's okay. When I was a child, it was okay to feel that discomfort. Discomfort teaches us what is right and what's wrong, and it helps us to sympathize and empathize with others. If we didn't ever feel discomfort, we would lack empathy. It's okay to be confronted with terrible things that people went through so that we can learn that these terrible things should not take place again. And to be honest, learning about these horrors is not as bad as living through them. So if black children are literally experiencing these painful realities, it will not hurt white children to simply learn about them. However, I will say when I was a child reading Amazing Grace and learning about gender and race discrimination, I did not feel a sense of guilt. I remember feeling sad for Grace when people told her that she couldn't play Peter Pan. And in the end of the book, when she gets the part, I was very overwhelmed by a feeling of triumph for her. So I think that this book really helped me to be aware of casual racism and racial discrimination, but it didn't make me feel a sense of white guilt. It taught me more so to have empathy for other people. And it made me feel like I wouldn't want to make someone feel the way that Grace's classmates had made her feel. When I was older and I learned more about the horrors of our country and violence against people of color, I definitely felt more of a sense of guilt that I had benefited from a system that was built to oppress other people. However, I did not drown in that guilt and hate myself for it, though. I tried to use it to propel me into action, to see what I could do to help and to be a better person. I was made aware of my privilege, and by being aware of it, I could use it in positive ways. Now, although there has recently been a huge shift towards diverse characters and diverse storylines in children's literature, it is still sometimes very difficult for young queer people to see themselves represented because most of the books that are banned in certain parts of America are books about diversity. In fact, the top 10 banned books are all books that deal with LGBTQIA plus storylines. In a very kind of goofy turn of events, actually, for several years, the most banned children's book in America is And Tango Makes Three by Justin Richardson, Henry Cole, and Peter Parnell. Here's a picture of it. You can see it says, "Challenge homosexuality." This is a book about the true story of two male penguins. The penguins, Roy and Silo, they lived in Central Park Zoo, and they took in a baby penguin with the help of a zookeeper. So if you want to get a clear example of just how rampant homophobia can be in this country, this is the most banned children's book, this book about gay penguins. Somehow this was seen as threatening family values, and currently this book is still banned in multiple school districts in Florida because it allegedly violates the state's Don't Say Gay law. This is, of course, laughable. It seems completely unhinged, but it is less laughable when it involves your life and your family. So if you think about having children and living in a place like that, if your children come from a queer family, they can't see themselves represented at all. They can't even see a book about a loving family of penguins. So it's not a place where I would feel comfortable raising children. However, not everyone can easily move away from where they live, right? We are often tied to places because of financial reasons, because of our family, because of our job. It's very expensive to just get up and move. Not everyone can do that. And everyone deserves to feel safe where they live, where they are, and they deserve to be able to read books like this to their children. So although the banning of children's books and the banning of critical race theory in classrooms sometimes seems kind of silly, it does have very real consequences. When queer and trans people are othered in this way, it makes it easier for acts of violence to be committed against them, against all types of queer people. If queer people are not seen as people, then we are not treated as people. A recent study actually conducted by UCLA found that trans women are 4 times more likely to be victims of violent crimes than their cisgender counterparts. And if they are trans women of color, they are even more likely than white trans women to be victimized. So how can we put a stop to this? Now, one way, I know this sounds a little silly, but I do truly believe that representation in media will help a little bit. When LGBTQIA people are seen as unknown and scary, they are treated very badly, of course, because they are seen as unknown and scary. When they are seen as real people, they are treated with more compassion. When we are part of a narrative, it is easier for us to live normal lives. Not only is it important for cisgender and or hetero people to see queer people as human, it is also important, very important, for queer people to see themselves living happy lives through media, right? So we don't need any more storylines about queer people being murdered or, like not being able to find love or being sad and alone. We need really some happy endings, some queer representation in media that is joyful and realistic, representation that focuses on the calm normalcy of queer life and not the constant threat of violence. But what is queer representation like in media, and how has it changed over the years? In American media, queer representation is starting to really blossom, but of course it was not always like this. When I was a kid, growing up in the 90s, I did not see many queer women or lesbians in movies or TV. There were certain movies that I was extremely drawn to, like, I'll show them to you, queer-coded media, like A League of Their Own or Fried Green Tomatoes, that very much seemed to have queer plots, right? Like it was, especially in Fried Green Tomatoes, because in the book they're together, but then in the movie they're just like best friends that have a food fight, and it's very confusing. And I thought, when I was like an 11-year-old and I was so into A League of Their Own and Fried Green Tomatoes, I was kind of confused by it because I was like, I guess I just love movies about strong female friendships where they seem like they're gonna kiss and then they don't kiss, I was like, this is cool and normal, but really this is weird. This is all that we had back then. But then in the late 90s and early 2000s, there started to be a few more out gay characters in TV and film, but many of them fed into stereotypes and tropes. Now these stereotypes can seem very harmless and fun. But they present characters as solely one-dimensional, which tends to dehumanize gay people. For example, in the 2001 film, Legally Blonde, what a classic, all of the gay characters are complete stereotypes. Now, before we get into this, I do want to say I love this movie. I'm not trying to drag it. It's a great movie. But let me just tell you, Elle Woods, the main character, she goes to Harvard Law where she meets one lesbian. There is only one lesbian in all of Harvard Law. And I will tell you, as someone who dated a lawyer before, that's not accurate. There must have been at least 5 lesbians there. But she only meets one. She meets one. And the one that she meets is mean and unattractive and makes fun of her. So this, of course, reinforces the stereotype that lesbians are mean, they're not attractive to men, and they don't support other women unless the women fit into the same man-hating kind of stereotype that they do. And sadly, even though I have never met a lesbian or queer woman who is actually like this in real life, that is still how many people view lesbians and queer women. Now, the gay men in this film get a much more fun edit, but they are all also very much one-dimensional stereotypes. They are flamboyant, loud, silly, feminine. Of course, there are many examples of early 2000s TV and film where gay people are portrayed in a much, much worse light. So we must not drag Legally Blonde. But the reason I use it as an example is because I've seen it like 100 times. And I would give it a 10 out of 10, no notes, except for the horrible representation of gay people. Although I was lucky enough to be coming out as a lesbian at a time where there was a good amount of accessible queer representation, there were still hurdles to overcome. Media that portrays lesbians is still ladled with stereotypes and tropes. The most common trope, which I'm sure a lot of you guys know about lesbian films, is that they are sad and long and filled with longing, right? It's just like movies where they're looking out the window, they're crying. It's like the Ammonite, which I rented Ammonite during the pandemic. If you want to know how deeply sad and lonely I was in 2020, I rented it, and it's like 2 hours and they barely speak and they look at rocks the whole time, and then at the end they're like, we can't be together. And that's like every lesbian movie ever made, basically. In fact, this trope of the like staring out the window being sad, it's so common in lesbian media. It is so common that Saturday Night Live actually did an entire sketch about it entitled Lesbian Period Drama, and they perfectly encapsulated what these movies entail. So it's hours of longing, sadness, it's like their hands almost touch but then they don't, and then suddenly there's a graphic sex scene and you're like, what's happening? Was this written by a man? It was, I'll tell you, it was. And the message that you really get from this is that, you know, to be a queer woman, to be a lesbian is to be lonely, and to be a lesbian is to never get married or live a happy, normal life. Now, I will say there are fun lesbian rom-coms and exceptions to this rule. I think, I don't know where it went, but you guys do have a picture of the incredible true story of Two Girls in Love, which I watched when I was like young. I think it's over there, right? That one's really good. That one is really good and fun. And it's fraught, you know, because it's like 1995, I think, when it came out. I just rewatched that recently. It's fraught. There's like some things going on, but it's fun, it's cute, it's a rom-com. There's also, let's think, what other lesbian rom-coms are there? There's the one, what's it called, with the British people? I can't remember.
Gentleman Jack.
What is it called?
Is there a Gentleman Jack?
Gentleman Jack, yes. I actually really like Gentleman Jack. That was good. I was sad that got canceled. That was good. Yes, Gentleman Jack is on HBO Max. That one's pretty good. They do end up together in the end, and I don't think anyone dies or anything, so that's good. Because usually somebody dies. So, but there are some good lesbian rom-coms. I promise there are some good ones. Not that many, but there are some. But, of course, if the story we're constantly being told is that to be a lesbian is to be a lonely person who only exists on the fringes of society, it can be hard to feel excited or happy about coming out. In fact, when I was first coming out, I was watching the Netflix series The Haunting of Bly Manor. There she is, Danny. I was excited to see it because I had heard that it contained a queer love storyline, but within the first 2 episodes, we see the main character, Danny. She leaves her male fiancé because she realizes that there is something a little different about her. They don't quite say that she's gay yet, but there's like something's a little bit different about her. And then her male fiance immediately walks into traffic and then gets hit by a bus. And then Danny flees to England where she continues to be haunted by his ghost. So in the end, Danny does get to have a wonderful queer love story, and it's very nice. But first, her coming out must hurt another person, and must be a shame that travels with her all the way across the Atlantic Ocean. So for me to be watching this at a time when I was also struggling with coming out and also leaving a long-term relationship with a man was not ideal. It wasn't the ideal thing to be watching. Now, thankfully, I will say my ex-husband and I are still great friends. Our relationship is very strong. He did not walk into traffic. He did not become a ghost. But this is not the type of media that you necessarily want to consume while you're trying to come to terms with being gay, and trying not to feel guilt for being not what people expected you to be. And I am saying this coming from the point of view of someone who lives in a very liberal bubble in New York City, and also is from here in Rochester, which, as you can see, there's a lot of great resources for gay people here in Rochester, and very liberal place here in Rochester. And I have extremely supportive parents and grandparents and an extensive group of queer friends. So if coming out was still a difficult process for someone who has all that, even under those circumstances, imagine how hard it must be for someone who has none of those things. And that is why queer storytelling really does matter, and that is why queer representation and queer joy are so important. If we cannot see ourselves, we cannot be ourselves. Okay. In 2019, my childhood best friend died. They were in many ways one of the brightest lights in my life. We had been friends for 20 years, and I honestly believe that it was because of them that I developed my unique sense of humor and became a comedian, because they were really funny. They were so funny. In our teens, and even into our 20s, we would have sleepovers where we stayed up all night laughing, and it was just really fun. We were very close. So my friend passed away after complications from top surgery, actually. And it has always really angered me that they died trying to become a more clear version of themselves. And it has also made me feel very wary of the healthcare provided to queer people in America. So then in 2020, I wrote an adult animation pilot about a young woman whose best friend dies, but they are reunited in a dreamscape. So this pilot was based off of recurring dreams I kept having that I had in the first 6 months after Elle died. And I thought if I was going to have PTSD about a terrible situation, I might as well make art out of it, I guess. So my pilot was bought by a production company, sold to a network, and I was able to enjoy having some money and Writers Guild of America benefits for a brief period of time. And although those were wonderful things to have, what I really wanted was to tell my friend's story. And in that story, I did not want to focus on death and sadness and pain, and the pain that comes with being queer sometimes, but instead, I wanted to focus on how funny my friend was, and how I knew that they were out there somewhere being funny in another dimension. And I will say, of course, I do always usually add this in, I would not ever want to discourage anyone from getting surgery, and what happens to them is a very rare situation. I think that everyone should pursue top surgery if they want to. But the main takeaway from that is just that my friend was awesome, and I like to talk about them. So recently, we'll talk about something more fun. Recently, my wife and I watched the Cartoon Network show Adventure Time and the follow-up series entitled Distant Lands. And we were so moved by the queer storyline between the characters Princess Bubblegum and Marceline that we ended up staying up late into the night having a very emotional talk about how we were so happy to be together and what a beautiful life we had created, which is very silly. And you might be like, these lesbians are too emotional. But we both had times in our lives where we had felt very lonely, and where we perhaps had fallen into the trap of thinking that to be queer is to be lonely, or to be unloved, or to be unfulfilled. These things are so untrue. I feel so happy and so fulfilled in my life. And if Princess Bubblegum and Marceline can be in love in a post-apocalyptic cartoon, then we can all be in love wherever we live, if it's in a small apartment in New York City, if it's in a house in Rochester, if we are just living with a wife, if we're living with cats, however, we can all find our own way. The stories we tell matter. It matters to see people like us. When I asked my mom for advice on writing this talk, she told me to remember that it is called a life story. We must all be brave in telling ours. I want to encourage all students to tell their life stories, even if they think it's not important or that no one will care. I cannot emphasize how important it really is. When I first started doing stand-up comedy 11 years ago, I honestly didn't know any other queer female comedians. Now every single show I do, every lineup is totally stacked. There's so many queer comedians. I remember when I was 15, I discovered my mom's Margaret Cho DVDs. And at the end of one of them, Margaret says she won't stop talking shit until another queer Asian American loudmouth comic comes and takes her place. And I remember being very moved by that and crying when I was 15, once again just furthering the point that I'm a very emotional person. But we cannot stop telling our stories, even if we are the only ones telling them. We must keep moving forward, and we must keep working towards our goals. I want to help students who achieve this goal so that in the future, nobody has to feel alone, no one has to feel othered. In fact, I want there to be so many queer comedians, so many lesbian comedians, that when you go see a show, you're just like, oh my God, another pink hair girl talking about her wife, what a hack, and then I will be happy. So thank you guys so much for joining me for this talk. Here's a picture of us dressed up as Bubblegum and Marceline. Thank you to the Rochester Rainbow Union. You guys have been awesome. I love you all very much. Thank you. Thank you. And now we still have a little bit, it's only been about 45 minutes. So if you guys want to talk for 10 or 15 minutes, we can. If you don't have any follow-up questions, just check out the library. Enjoy the rest of your night. If you do have any, we can talk now. And thank you guys so much.